Over 2 years ago, when I called my mother to tell her that I was going to request ordination, she asked me a very skillful question, and I maybe don't remember the exact wording, but it was something like, "What worries do you have about making this decision?" And it was something I could answer fairly quickly because I had been spending time really looking at what my concerns were about ordination and addressing them in meditation. So, for instance, initially I was worried, well, in ordaining at the Abbey, I'm thinking about this as making a commitment to train and practice and share the Dharma here. Well, what if the Abbey burns down? And I mentioned this to my mom because it was, of course, a real possibility. Another concern is, well, right now we're supported by so much kindness and generosity from others. But I can't take that for granted. Someday that might be less, even to the extent of the pantry being empty. So, again, yeah, it's a concern. But in meditation, I could look at these and see that any of the difficulties that I could think of that would come up here, living here as an ordained person here, these difficulties, a different version of them could just occur in lay life, occur somewhere else. And the difference was really, am I working with my mind? Am I learning to work with these difficulties? In the middle scope of the Lam Rim, when we're looking at renunciation, really cultivating that determination to be free from samsara, there are different lists that we reflect on regarding the difficulties that we face. And the one I find most helpful are the 8 difficulties that we experience as human beings. We reflect on this not for the sake of becoming depressed or, wishing we were a cat instead of a human, but in really having a realistic view of what our situation here is. And this is what the Buddha taught, that our situation in samsara and cyclic existence is fundamentally unsatisfactory. We experience birth, aging, sickness, and death. The last 4 in the list for human beings is that we're separated from what we like. We meet with what we don't like, and even if we work really hard for something that we like, we might not get it. And our body and mind are subject to afflictions and karma. So, reflecting on these unsatisfactory situations really can help me be a little bit more content with the situation that I have. To not just always wish that, my body didn't hurt so much or that the food tasted a little bit better, that every day could be Thanksgiving. Really, a big part of my practice has been in cultivating contentment, but not to be happy with my situation in samsara and think that samsara is some wonderful thing that I can find true and lasting happiness here, but instead to not put energy in to constantly making something better, to not expend that energy of trying to avoid all problems in the future, because those problems are going to come. Of that list of 8, I've certainly experienced 7 of them in this current life. The 8th, death, it's definitely going to come. So instead of trying to fight with these and say, okay, I never want to be sick, how can I make sure I never get sick? Instead, I can work with my mind when I do get sick. So that first concern I had that I brought up with my mom, that, well, what if the Abbey burns down? Well, instead of saying, okay, I want to live in a place that will always be safe, that has no risk of any dangers, instead, yes, I've chosen to live here at the Abbey, and a few months ago we had that situation of needing to evacuate because there was a close by fire. And so, having looked at this situation in meditation before it happened, I had seen that there was a lot of attachment to the Abbey, attachment to the way things are, to the buildings, the trees, the deer. But there's ways for us to work with attachment. One of the reflections that we do in the Lamra meditations on attachment is really asking, well, what's the worst case scenario that will happen if we're separated from that thing that we're attached to? And so looking at that for the Abbey in meditation, it's, well, I think the community would reform somewhere else, or would temporarily be somewhere else, or we would be hosted by our friends in Spokane and Coeur d'Alene, exactly as what happened. And so by reflecting on this, I could see, yes, of course, I don't want the Abbey to burn down, but if that was to happen, I could work with it. I could continue my practice, and I could be part of the community that does its best to reform after that. So then a second situation, again, well, what if I get really sick at the Abbey, or eventually as I'm facing old age and death, well, what if I don't have kids to care for me? Well, again, no guarantee in whatever path I chose in life that I would definitely be taken care of. But then again, in the past few months, we saw this come up that almost the entire community was sick in bed with COVID. And so instead of really giving into aversion, that notion of, okay, I feel bad, I don't want to feel bad, I don't want this, I'm so scared what's going to happen, instead, I could really look at it and work with my mind using the techniques that we've learned from the Dharma. I could view that situation as exhausting my negative karma, even seeing it as a beneficial situation. I could see it really showing me that my body is not this wonderful, blissful source of happiness, that it is, in fact, a disgusting source of suffering. And it was very clear when we were sick. In addition, there were ways to really take that and think about renunciation. Again, that sickness is part of our experience, it's part of the experience of other living beings too. And we can then cultivate compassion as well for them, knowing that so many people had much worse situations than we did when they were sick with COVID and when they're sick with other things. And then with that mentality, we could even do Tonglen in that situation of really taking the suffering of others and giving them our happiness, even while we feel poor. Whenever I do feel unwell for whatever reason, I also bring to mind the fact that at the time of death, I'm going to feel pretty crappy, probably. And I want to be able to practice then. So every time I have the opportunity to practice when I'm not feeling well, it's wonderful preparation for the time of death, when my mind's not going to be very sharp and my body's not going to feel very good. And I really want to be able to practice at the time of death. So, yes, we've had difficulties in this past few months. And if I wasn't living here, maybe I wouldn't have faced these particular difficulties. But there would have been some other difficulties somewhere else, some other aspect of my life where things wouldn't quite be going right. And here, instead of putting energy into trying to fix the world or avoid problems, I've been able to put that energy into my practice and really taking these difficulties as an opportunity to work with my mind and to grow. And that's only been possible because I've been so immersed in the Dharma here, with my teachers, with the other Sangha members who are our wonderful Dharma friends, with the prayers and motivations we do every single day, with the precepts that guide me to do virtuous things rather than try to numb myself out with whatever substance or entertainment. So I really rejoice that I made this choice to face these difficulties, to take them onto the path, rather than to pursue a life where I simply try to flee from them or avoid them when that's really not possible. So I hope that as I continue to face difficulties in this life, that I can continue practicing with them, that I can grow with them, growing my compassion, growing my good qualities in my practice, so that in those situations I can not just myself avoid falling to despair, but also be of benefit to others, both in the short term, even in those times of difficulties, and also then in the long term, deepening my practice and being able to help others deepen theirs as well until we all attain Buddhahood.